So, welcome to The Legend of Zelda, The Four Swords Adventures, which I will hereafter refer to as simply Four Swords. For those curious, there is another game called just Four Swords. When I say game, I effectively mean mini-game. It's just this tiny little chunk of the GBA port of LTTP. Doesn't count for anything, and I'll never talk about it ever again. Whew, it's gone. So this is now forevermore Four Swords. We're all clear? Good. This is the best Zelda game you've never played. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, oh, no, I've totally played this game. Statistically speaking, however, most of the people who are watching this right now probably have not. Now, before I get too much into the why, I want to talk about something weird. I've got several things I just want to get out right at the bat here. They're all kind of related, so I'm just going to kind of hash them out in sort of a stream of consciousness kind of thing, which I normally do anyways. I do have notes, don't worry. I swear I have notes. Nobody in my stream believe me. I just streamed this game. Four Swords was doomed from the get-go for two big reasons. One, and most importantly, it was marketed terribly. This is a game that was marketed as a multiplayer game where you had to have the adapter to play it. You would probably be surprised at how many people to this day, and this actually happened today, the day I'm recording this, I actually had someone make this comment that, well, I thought you had to have the adapter to play this. Because that's how the game was marketed. They were trying to push that GBA adapter, which was a pile of crap and failed, I might add. But unlike certain other adapter games, notably Crystal Chronicles, which basically forced you to use it and forced you to have multiplayer, this is neither. I could play this just with the GameCube controller, on my GameCube, by myself, and it was just fine. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't play multiplayer if you have the availability. I never have. I cannot comment on that, other than what other people have told me. I have been told, especially by Pax, who has played multiplayer mode in this, that it's actually a lot of fun. But even Pax, who played this game, multiplayer, but still, had never actually played it single player because he thought he couldn't. That's how bizarre the design is, the marketing is of this game. So, let me just get this out there. I love this game. It's a great game. It could have been better, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's still an amazing game, and I recommend if you can go out there and get a copy of it to do so. And like I said, you can just play it with your GameCube controller. No need for any of that other fuss. No need for the rest of the muss. You can just play it that way. You'll be fine. Now, the other problem isn't so much a problem as it is something that just makes me cry a little inside. When I go re-go through a series, my opinions on that series tend to vary, usually just a little bit. You know, it's not like I go from hating a game to loving a game or vice versa, but usually my specific feelings on an individual game tend to change, especially when I go through with analysis mode on. I've talked about this before, how when I have analysis mode on, it changes my perspective on things because I'm really thinking about them. It's one of the reasons Insurrection kind of fell in my perspective when I was going through that movie. But this is a similar circumstance, but in a different direction. Going through this game with analysis mode on, honestly, I feel like this game might actually overtake LTTP for top-down Zeldas for me. And that's having just recently replayed LTTP, mind you. Now, go ahead, get out your pitchfork, stab me to death, it's okay, I understand. I'm okay with it. But the thing that makes me weep is this would have definitely been a better game than LTTP if not for Miyamoto. Don't take me the wrong way. Miyamoto has done some great things in his years, but he's not infallible, he's not always right, and he has actually done a lot of things to mess up certain franchises across the years. Because he has so much influence, when he says something, it just... See, here's the thing, and we're going to talk about this a lot more next week when we talk about Ocarina of Time, but the Zelda timeline is borked. Everyone knows this. But when you analyze it, when you pick apart the timeline, there's actually only two pieces that don't fit. The third timeline and this game, Four Swords Adventures. These are the only two pieces that don't actually fit. The rest of it actually flows pretty congruently with itself. I mean, if you remove those, we've got Skyward leading into Minish, and I've already talked about how that works. Minish leading into Ocarina, I've already talked about how that works. Ocarina splits, we've got Wind Waker, Phantom, Spirit, and Twilight Princess. All of that flows. There's no issues there. It's when you add the third timeline in, and Four Swords, that it just gets mussed up. For those of you who don't know, Four Swords in the official canon timeline occurs after Twilight Princess, which I'd say makes no sense at all, but it actually kind of does, and it's just messed. So here's the thing. When I first saw the official timeline, I thought it was a hoax. The reason why is because of this game. I thought there was no way in hell that Four Swords could be a game after Twilight Princess. I mean, there's no connecting features there. There's nothing whatsoever. I mean, literally nothing that ties in Twilight Princess to Four Swords. It was nonsensical. Four Swords made way more sense of happening, say, immediately after Ocarina of Time, which I'll talk about in a minute. But no, it was there, and I'm like, that can't be. But now I have the physical copy of the Historia, ignoring the fact that the internet has confirmed this many times since then. So, But if you think about it logically, this is also the only place it could fit. It can't occur in between Ocarina of Wind Waker. That period of time is very well covered thanks to Wind Waker's backstory. It couldn't occur after Wind Waker because the water problem, right? So that whole timeline is basically off limits. Can't happen there. It has to happen after Minish Cap. That's mandatory because Vadi is in it and the Four Sword has already been generated in it, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it doesn't really fit anywhere logically in the third timeline, with one exception, which again I'll get to in a moment. So really, there was only one place you could drop this game, given what happened to it, which is Miyamoto. I'm gonna stop dancing around the topic. This was originally going to be the Imprisoning War game. Now, I imagine that some of you out there are going to respond with, huh? And some of you, but I imagine some of you out there are going to have the same reaction I did when I first found out this news, which was, oh, because that would have been so awesome. For those of you who don't know, the Imprisoning War was the big hole in the Zelda timeline. And they were deliberately leaving it open. See, here's the thing. In official canon, Ocarina of Time is the Imprisoning War. They may change that in the future, but that's how it is right now. But it doesn't actually line up. Ocarina of Time does not fully fit all the pieces of the Imprisoning War as we are told it. And that has always bugged theorists and fans of this timeline like myself. So this game now actually becoming the Imprisoning War and fully connecting Ocarina to this, to Link to the Past, would have been perfect. It would have filled in all of those blanks and really showcased so much. And it was going to be awesome. Now, and then the problem is Miyamoto came in and said it. I almost don't believe this. He said it was too complicated. He said the story was too complicated. Get rid of the story. What ensued is the story of Four Swords, which if you really analyze it, is all over the place. Now, there's some really good stuff here story-wise, and I'll be talking about that. But the reason it's so inconsistent with itself is because half the story for this being the Imprisoning War was already written, and they just kind of adapted that to the new story in order to accommodate his, frankly, draconian whims. Now, I know there's going to be people out there that disagree with me on this, but again, this was something they were already doing. This was something they were already well in advance and working for, and again, was a perfect puzzle piece for the Zelda franchise. And instead, he just kicked it out. Nah. Less story. Too complicated. What? I want to smack you, Miyamoto. just once. Nothing out, no big rancor here. It's just because again, I'm not actually angry. I'm just sad at what could have been. Because if you play this game, you see so many of the pieces of the Imprisoning War in here. The advancement of Ganondorf into Ganon, the adding of the trident to the equation and its connection to the Twilight, which I'll talk about later. The imprisonment of him by the maidens, who effectively are the sages. All of these pieces are in place. I digress, I suppose. There's one other thing I'm going to mention here, because it is relevant more so here than it was in Minish Cap. Originally, the Four Sword we had and then reforged and then empowered in Minish Cap was going to be the Master Sword. The original purpose for Minish Cap was not just to tell the origin story of all of Hyrule, but of the Master Sword itself. And if you think about it, that really makes all those puzzle pieces just line right into place, because especially with this game, if you imagine it's the Master Sword instead of the Four Sword, it really starts to show how this was the Imprisoning War and how this would fit basically perfectly into the Zelda timeline. Instead, it's the odd man out, because the Four Sword is a completely different sword that's only used 3 times, if we're getting technically, 2 times that actually matter, and these 2 times it is then basically forgotten and never looked at again, because Miyamoto insisted it not be the Master Sword. Whatever. Moving on. let's talk about now. There are a couple of negatives about this game. I would argue, this is the least Zelda game, at least as far as Zelda games that actually exist. And I'm also not counting, the crossbow training thing or anything like that. That doesn't count, obviously, or the thing that we never talk about. this It's a level based game. Now, when I first streamed this, I tried to do what I'm about to do to you. I tried to describe the game, and I kind of failed. And people are like, that just sounds really weird. And I'm like, okay, look, just watch me play it for a bit. About 30 minutes or 40 minutes in, I had showcased several stages, because there's stages, like a Mario game. You have separate levels. There's 8 worlds, for lack of a better word, 3 levels per world, and there's a couple of oddities in that. And I showcased a few stages, and they're like, this is actually really cool. And I'm like, yeah, it's weird. It is different. It is the most different Zelda, like I said, even more so than Zelda 2, but it is good. So here's a couple things they do. Like I said, it's level based, but that lets them really focus on level design. One of the biggest problems from a designing perspective is marrying exploration value with dungeon design and making the two smoothly and seamlessly move into each other. Now, the Zelda team has done this many times, but it is a very difficult thing to do. It is much easier and much more fluid from a designing perspective to put all your effort into one or the other. Now, previous Zelda games have tried to get around this. This is why the Oracle's games were all a dungeon. The whole world was a dungeon. Skyward did this too, actually. Skyward Sword, as one of my viewers pointed out. They got around that problem by just making everything a dungeon, so their design philosophy was always dungeon and never really explore. Minish Cap kind of went the other way with that, making everything the overworld, everything explorative, which also worked. In fact, in my opinion, worked a lot better. But this one, with each thing being a stage, it's all about level design. At this point, it's all about making the most unique, fun, interesting, innovative, different stuff we can do in each level to really challenge the player, both puzzle-wise and combat-wise. So it actually kind of abandons the very idea of dungeons or overworld, exploration or puzzle design. It's all just about the level design. And so that's a different focus, but again, they focus on it very tightly, and so it's very well executed and very well presented. Now, this manifests in a few different ways that adds some strange tactical perspective to the matter. And I'm going to try and talk about this gameplay-wise here as best as I can, because again, the best way to showcase this is for you to just watch me play it, which is why I streamed this one. For example, you can have one item equipped at a time in addition to your sword, and, well, that's it, which is kind of similar to the handheld games, Link's Awakening and the 2 Oracles games. But the difference is there's no pause menu to swap that out. That doesn't exist. Instead, you can only have the one item on you, period. You can have the bow, you can have the boomerang, you can have the bomb, you can have the hammer, you can have the flame rod, which is freaking awesome, you can have Rock's Feather, which is freaking awesome, etc. And that's it. So the way this works out is unique because you have all the tools necessary to beat each level in that level. There's no such thing as running into a dead end. There's no such thing as you've put yourself into a corner. There's no such thing as you have to backtrack or whatever in order to find stuff. All the stuff is there. The challenge then becomes what order to do things. Now, this isn't so much represented in the earlier levels. I'd say the first 3 or 4 worlds are mostly a tutorial of how this new type of Zelda works. But in the later worlds, in the later levels, it becomes very clear that you have to actually figure out what order to pick up what items in order to do what actions in the right order so you can actually make your way forward, right? And again, it's very tight level design, very well done. There's some really fun stuff in here. One of my favorite examples of this is actually the Village of the Blue Maiden, aka the level where there's only one piece of combat in the entire stage. The entire rest of it is non-combat. This is even balanced out by the Kakariko Village section, which is very, very light on combat, and yet still serves some awesome story points, which I'll talk about later. So in addition to that tactical choice, they also have the choice of the 4 people. Now, again, single-player perspective. I have no idea how this is multiplayer. But when you're walking around with the chain like this, this is the main guy, and you're walking around like this is your only hitbox right here, the front guy. These last guys could be standing in fire or being struck or whatever. Doesn't matter. But when you form up into formation, all of a sudden the hitbox of all 4 of you count. So if the guy in the back gets hit, the whole team gets hit, right? So you make yourself much more vulnerable by going into formation, and yet you get so many more tactical benefits for doing so. For example, if you're in the quad formation, the square like this, when you do a swing, you cover a nice big area, and you basically can get all four of your sword swings in a single attack. So you can do tons of damage to bosses, for example. When you're in the line, like this, same general concept, but for example, if you're hitting a swarm of enemies, you can kind of move your way through the swarm with all four of you. And of course, there's the triangle thing, which is great for doing the spin attack and getting large amounts of area, or just exploring large chunks of loot very quickly. You have all these options, which have both a benefit and a detriment, so it is a tactical choice, and I really like that. I also like how certain things just kind of are there by default. For example, the roll. Just like in Minish Cap, you can roll by default. You don't have to do anything else by that. You can also move items and pick up basic items. You know, some of the things that would be power-ups in other Zelda games are by default in this one. You can still get empowered to do better. For example, you can get the certain bracelet to pick up like trees, for example, or you can get the Pegasus boots, which allow you to move around. And you can also, this is really cool, in some of the levels there's a great fairy that will upgrade your items. Now, not every item can be upgraded, but the ones that can usually are A, mandatory for beating level, but B, basically add some cool factor. Bigger bombs, the ability to create those blocks like in LTTP with the fire rod, the ability to use the Pegasus boost to run over completely empty terrain, just going over pits and the like, and so forth. There's a few of them, and they're all pretty awesome. And so I like the variety. I also love the visual storytelling this game does. I don't want to get too much into that, but the level design complements that, and that's why I wanted to mention that here. Let me actually check my notes for the first time, because I've just been talking from memory. Like I said, I just finished the game. The graphics are awesome. The graphics are very sharp and a wonderful mix. It's the weirdest thing. It is a literal hybrid of Wind Waker's graphics and Link to the Past graphics that the two just blend seamlessly. Like, and I don't know how to describe it better than that. You have to actually watch the game in action, because there's actual, like, it's Link to the Past, but like the visual effects, the fire, the magic stuff, that's all fully rendered 3D, high graphics GameCube stuff. Well, high graphics at the time, GameCube stuff. And a lot of the enemy designs and a lot of the areas are clearly inspired from Wind Waker stuff, with the Phantom Ganon being the most obvious example, although the Big Poe is there as well. And it just works. I don't even know how to explain it. It just works. I mentioned the level design. The sound and music is amazing in this game. Each NPC you talk to has a little sound snippet to indicate who you're talking to. Each link has a different modulator. There we go, modulator put onto the voice so you can tell which link is which. And the music itself is often remixed stuff from previous Zeldas, but also includes its own brand new music for new areas. I cannot praise the sound and music design of this game enough. It is top notch. It is actually probably the best sound design of all the Zeldas, I'd say, in my opinion. And that's already some really impressive company, because all the Zeldas in general have really good sound design. More gameplay stuff. I mentioned the Village of the Blue Maiden. That's right there. And the puzzles. The puzzles are so diverse. I just want to mention this one really quick. There's a puzzle where you have to move a house. And you have to move a house in a certain way to defeat your enemies. You have to crush them with a house. That's just cool. There's a lot of random cool factor in this game. There's a section where you have just gotten the bow, and the game knows you've just gotten the bow because it was in the previous room. And you pick up the bow because you have no item private set. And you walk into this room, and there's a hallway filled with like 50 enemies. It's like, oh crap. But if you line up, power up the bow, and let go, the arrows will keep going and like just impale all the enemies up against the wall and kill them. Now, it's not like those enemies are hard. It's not like they really threaten you. It's just there for cool factor. There's a lot of that in this game. I mentioned the level item. I mentioned the logic puzzles. There's sections where you can ride a horse, which is awesome. You trample everything in your path. You go really, really fast, and it's very tightly controlled. That's freaking amazing. There's actually stealth sections, exactly 2 of them in the entire game. But they're really good. They're some of my favorite levels, actually. I'd say like in the top 5 or so of my levels includes the 2 stealth section levels, because it's exactly what a stealth section should be. There's a clear indicator of what's going to make you be caught. If you make a loud noise, aka if you break a pot, the spotlights, which is what you're trying to avoid, go straight to that pot. So you can actually use that as a distraction, and indeed kind of have to in some of the cases, unless you're really quick or really good, which I am neither. And there's the penalty for getting caught is not too severe, but it is bad enough that you want to avoid it. And overall, it's just really fun sneaking your way through. And it's like, okay, I don't want to get caught. Just kind of getting through, Oh, excuse me. They do a two-layer thing, just like Minish Cap did. In different direction though. Minish Cap had the miniature one with the mundane obstacles, which was fun and awesome and amazing. And I think that's actually better than this version. But this is a still similar idea because there's the dark world aspect of things, which will have some lower relevance later. So like you've got your top world and you got your dark world, and the two interact just like they did in LTTP. You remember how I mentioned I wish that had been more interactive between the two in LTTP? That's exactly what they did here. In one instance, and I showed this on the stream, in one instance, someone in the Shadow Realm could actually pick up the Link in the normal realm and carry him across a pit that didn't exist in the Shadow Realm in order to get him to his destination. There's a lot of that interactability and a lot of going back and forth in order to make the puzzles work, which is awesome puzzle design, awesome level design, and very fun stuff. What else we got here? The Maidens. Hang on. What else have we got here? Sorry, I just had to crush a bug that was walking across my path there. Bugs take priority, as you all know. Is that everything I have to say gameplay-wise? I feel like I want to say more, but there really isn't much more to say gameplay-wise. It's just a really, really fun, really well-designed game. So even purely for the gameplay, I recommend this. Let's talk about the story. Now, in my head canon, forevermore, ever after learning this fact about this game and the original intention, I'm just going to go ahead and say that in my head canon, this game is the Imprisoning War as it should be, because it just makes so much sense. And it fits itself, therefore, in between Ocarina and LTTP, right? But that's head canon. We're here to talk about regular canon, so everything I'm going to be saying is going to be taking the official canon into account, which is relevant because that completely changes some of the things I would otherwise say. For example, timeline placement. Think about this for a moment. This is unique and also explains a couple of things. Given the time in which this game occurs, this occurs basically at the same time as LTTP and Wind Waker. Now, we don't know exactly, but the evidence is very significant in both cases. Not only the design of the world, but the active forces that were relevant within it. And it also kind of explains why this game has a visual design reminiscent of LTTP and Wind Waker. And if you don't understand what I mean, here's the three timelines. Year 5 across all three is still year 5. It's just different timeline, right? So year 50 is when LTTP occurs, and year 50 is when Wind Waker occurs, and year 50 is when Four Swords occurs. I don't know the exact year. Don't give me that, but the point remains. So I like that idea. I like the presentation. It also makes a lot of sense why Hyrule looks so similar to the LTTP Hyrule, because it is effectively the same Hyrule at that time. It's just the Twilight Princess Hyrule instead of the dumb Hyrule. But anyways, I'm not saying LTTP is dumb. I'm saying the third timeline is done. Because it was dumb. It was just ripped out of someone's butt. But anyways, predicated out of nowhere. One of the other things, hang on, so there's the timeline thing, the original prison where I already mentioned that. One of the things this game does really well is setting building. There's a lot of establishment of, like, just people. There's a lot of just people who have things to say that really, really help flesh out this world. There's tons of NPCs to talk to. I mentioned earlier there's stage where there's no combat, well, except for the one little bit in the village. And Kakariko, let's go ahead and tie that in together because it's a great way to showcase something else this game does well, but I'll get into that in a moment. But while you're in the village of the Blue Maiden, you talk to all these mages who are really happy Vadi is out. Why? Well, the implication is that magic is now stronger in the world because a strong mage is in the world. And even if that mage is evil, it still benefits mages as a whole. Now, I say that because these mages are clearly not evil. In fact, the big story arc, spoiler alerts incoming, by the way, the big story arc for the Blue Maiden Village is the mages are being, oh god, they're being accused of this horrible thing, and they didn't do any of it. They are completely innocent. They're just normal citizens like the other citizens are. And I like that idea. I like that the way that kind of adds to the mythos of Zelda in general. The idea that if someone of significant power is out and about, it affects the way the world runs a little bit. So, like, because Vadi is out and about, because these people gain more magic. This is also shown later on because Ganon is out about. Those creatures, which are creatures that naturally adhere to darkness, like the Dekus, they are better off. They enjoy life more. They're going to be able to advance more and further their lives. And I like that idea. And it is kind of something that you see throughout the Zelda series in little bits, but it's really obvious and really well presented here. Um, the other thing they do cool is the game starts off and you're in lush green fields and all that fun stuff, and then it kind of gets worse from there, right? But the thing that's cool about that, no pun intended, is that as you go through, time is actually advancing, and the game goes out of its way, again with that visual storytelling, to show you just how bad things are getting. That with Vadi and Ganon both out, the world is literally kind of becoming a more harsh, more difficult place to live in. And indeed, we get the very strong impression this is basically becoming an equivalent of the Dark World, like we had over in LTTP. Not literally, of course, not the Morphic Realm thing, but that kind of a plane and that kind of an existence, that kind of a world. So, like, you start off in the nice areas, you actually return to some of the areas you've been to before, and those places are much worse than they were the first time. And when you get to the woods, which used to be the green woods, by the time you reach them, they're dark and there's skulls and all that fun stuff. By the time you get to the place where there's frozen Hyrule, that place is completely covered in snow, and the implication, because that's where the Four Sword was, is that because that's the nexus point of the curse of Vadi, that's where that curse is literally freezing the land around there, and it's going to keep spreading unless you stop it. So all this is really great setting building stuff. The maidens themselves are actually a really fascinating aspect of this. They're interesting characters, mostly in the tiny little tidbits of their lore, and it's really well hidden. But they're vassals. They're leaders. Each area has a maiden who rules that section of the land. Now, I love this idea for several reasons. I would have liked this idea better in the Imprisoning War, but I think I've beaten that horse dead sufficiently. First of all, I want to talk about how the maidens are innately magical, which is something I kind of like the idea of, because these are supposed to be the sages, or at least I guess at this point, the descendants of the sages. But they also it is clear they have some magical power in them, and the implication is really strong that the only thing that keeps them bound is the darkness that's around them, because that's something the sages simply lack the ability to combat on their own. Once you break the darkness, the sages break themselves out of the crystals. They break themselves out. They don't need your help at that point, because they're fine, and they can fly around and teleport and do whatever. The other thing that's interesting is each maiden tends to have the ability to teleport only to their domain, the place that they rule, the place that they watch over. And I like that, because that makes perfect sense that they wouldn't have perfect teleportation. It's more like a recall. They can always go back to this area. That's also a great way to keep the player going around to where they need to go. And so, you rescue the maiden that lives up here, so you recall with her up to there and do the next dungeon. Make sense? But the vassal thing makes perfect sense to me, and also ties in with the Hyrule Knights thing. Using the official canon, this follows Twilight Princess. Well, what happened in Twilight Princess? We saw an ineffectual kingdom, which was just completely sitting on its laurels, it had terrible leadership, a completely non-existent military for all intents and purposes, and a land that was practically ungoverned. And it showed, and Twilight Princess really showed how bad things would get when your leadership is not actually leading. Fast forward to Four Swords, and all of a sudden we have each sage and each maiden, as they're called in this one, is actively governing one of the areas, and each of these maiden is one of the magically empowered individuals, and embodied, or not embodied, but working at the behest of Princess Zelda herself. They're vassals. They're literally vassal lords, and I like the idea that in order to I mean, there's several different ways they can do this. First of all, there's the idea that the maidens, the sages, whoever had this magical power, took power, just said, we're not going to let this happen again, so I'm going to govern this area, you're going to govern this area, etc., etc. There's also the idea that this is a merger concept, that each of these maidens and sages, across however many years it's been between Twilight Princess and Four Swords, had their own duties and responsibilities, magically speaking, like the actual sages did, both in Ocarina and in the intro to Twilight Princess. And so they then kind of naturally grew to become not so much the leaders as like the protectors of their realm, because it could be interpreted that these are not lords so much as not overseers, guardians. Guardians is the word I'm going for, of these particular realms. Or it could be a merger of these two ideas, that they started off, protecting and safeguarding, and they just kind of naturally merged into a leadership role and started actually governing their given region and their given chunk of Hyrule. All of this just really speaks to the politics and the consequence, which is what I like about it, of Twilight Princess. It shows that Twilight Princess's effects had an impact on the story and an impact on the people. So they demanded some kind of change. Something had to change. This also ties into the Knights of Hyrule. There's no denying in my mind whatsoever that in the new, this canon timeline, that Link, the Link from Twilight Princess, went around and said, "Okay, y'all are terrible. I'm going to show you how to be an actual knight. I should know. My ancestor showed me, the hero of time from Ocarina of Time." And so he continues the traditions and teachings and shows them how to do all this stuff. And of course, he has the legendary bloodline, and he establishes the Knights of Hyrule, the elite leaders of Hyrule, which each govern and protect one of the four gems of whatever. The gems aren't really that significant, but the point being that's where the four knights come into the play. And the idea that each of those four knights are responsible for the general safeguarding of the realm. It also adds, if you think about it in this way, it also adds a little bit of significance to how Ganon was able to destroy these four knights so effortlessly, just emphasizing his power compared to them, which I think is just kind of a cool little thing. I talked about the mages thing. I talked about that thing and Kakariko. Kakariko's I wanted to talk about Kakariko just a little bit more. Kakariko, by the time you reach it, everything's been bad for a while, and the darkness that has been spreading has affected that place. Again, it's making kind of a dark world situation, like from LTTP, and so a lot of people there who were otherwise ordinary people are much harsher or more difficult. And of course, there are actually thieves now. Lots of thieves, actually, far more than there were before. And this is mentioned. The idea, it's kind of like the Earthbound effect, how Gygas's very existence is simply pulling out the more evil and darker thoughts of people and causing them to go darker, literally. And I like that concept. I like how that's a great contrast, because when you go to the village of the Blue Maiden, everyone's innocent. The mages are innocent. The people are innocent. They're just scared. They don't know what to do. By the time you get to Kakariko, it's a similar situation. It's still mostly a non-combat area with lots of lore and lots of setting building and lots of NPCs, except a lot of those NPCs are now antagonistic, both in dialogue and the fact that the thieves are literally trying to rob you every time they see you. So you can see how the world is kind of getting worse without you actually trying to salvage the situation, or because of how Ganon and the darkness that is spreading is affecting them. I also, just as an aside, really like the idea of the guild. It's something that's in the Village of the Blue Maiden, and it's the Seekers Guild is what it's called, and it's a cool concept that I've always loved ever since I first saw it in whatever. But I remember it most strongly in Breath of Fire 2. It's like an adventurers guild, except your job is to just do whatever. Go clear out a dungeon, go do someone's laundry, go help someone's cat, go mow the lawn, go swimming with this person. It can be any variety of things, and it can apply to more combat-oriented or more skill-oriented. You are a person for hire for whatever. And I don't know how to describe that, really. I'm sure there's a term for that or a trope for that, but I've always loved that concept, and so I really liked the Seekers Guild because it always felt like that kind of a thing, and it was a nice touch to the setting. More world building here. Speaking of which, this is a very dark game. A very dark game. Ignoring the things I mentioned earlier, it's also worth noting that the strong implication is there that it's impossible for everyone to really coexist with each other, even though they don't really have any harsh feelings towards each other. I mentioned the Deku earlier. None of those Deku are evil. None of them are brats. None of them are just like, aha, I can't wait to kill everyone. They just want to live their lives. But they can't because they're restricted to the forest thanks to the fact that that's where they have to be, thanks to their nature. This darkness spreading is great for them. So great, we get to go out and enjoy our lives, but it's bad for us. It's the same thing we see with the mages. The mages are happy that all this magic is now in the world, but that's bad for everyone else. And as we can literally see the consequences of magic being uncontrolled and being so much stronger than it was before, as it kind of messes up several people's lives back in the village, unintentionally, I might add. Because again, there's no malice here. These people aren't villains or antagonistic or even opposites. They just happen to like different things. And you see how that kind of makes an interesting gray versus gray contrast, which I really like. But I mentioned this game was dark. My favorite example of this is the dead people. There are dead people in this game. I'm not talking about the pose. I'm talking about every now and again you'll meet a ghost of a lonely old man who's just tired and worn out, and he's lamenting the fact that he died because he lacked the ability to get through the puzzles that you have the power to get through. All of that's pretty bad, but I'm just going to go ahead and share this. I shared this on stream. There's a little girl in the graveyard who is dead and crying because the pose that were there were mocking her because all her friends left her. I mention this because, as I've said before and will say again in the future, Basically, all the Zeldas are really dark games. You just have to really think about it in some cases, or pry beneath the surface in some cases. It's only Twilight Princess and Majora's Mask that are obviously dark. Every Zelda game is dark. It's just a matter of how and where. Um, Vadi. Let's talk about Vadi. I mentioned him briefly back in Minish Cap. I'm going to mention him briefly again, but the interesting thing about Vadi here is initially I was upset because he was a full-fledged talking, had lines, had dialogue, had scenes character back in Minish Cap, right? I mean, he was the main villain. He was the only villain, actually. No Ganondorf, no anything like that. And yet, here he has 0 lines. Let me refresh that. Let me make this clear. Vadi, the Minish, the former Minish, has 0 lines in this game. But when I really played the game, I played Minish right before this, played them back to back. And when I really sat down and thought about it, I realized how much sense that makes, because it is the completion of his character arc. He was a Minish, a little guy who was curious about the evil and deeds in people's hearts, and he was really wondering and curious about it. He wanted the power, he wanted to explore, he wanted to know more. He became this big, awful thing, and he eventually morphed into the wind sorcerer, demon-looking thing that he became, right? The reason this is the completion of his arc is this is the same thing that happened to Ganondorf. For a different reason, admittedly. But this is him becoming corrupted into effectively being a beast. Vadi in this game is no longer a person. He is merely a creature, a monster, and nothing more than a monster who only seeks to exist. This also ties nicely into that thing I mentioned earlier, about how his very existence makes there be more magic. No, that's intentional. It's just a byproduct of this monster being in the world. And as another showcasing of why it is overall a bad thing. It's also worth noting several of the mages help us against Vadi because they understand that long term this isn't tenable. This isn't going to work long term. So I really like that idea and like that this is the completion of his character arc. All of his thoughts, all the evil he wanted to understand and learn more about, all the power he wanted, he's got it. He's just lost everything else in exchange. Now, the realm of the heavens, I'm just going to say this bluntly, I think it's Skyloft. I have been of the strong opinion for a long time that Skyloft actually comes into the game twice after Skyward Sword. Once in Twilight Princess, with the ruins in the sky, and once here, with the realm of the heavens. In both cases, it makes sense to be. They're both ancient places of great power that have been abandoned for forever. And in both cases, they tend to be significant for the overall story arc of the game and tend to be near the end of the game. The Twilight Princess significance isn't nearly as much because it's basically just another dungeon. It just has to be a dungeon of the ancients. But I still feel like the pieces fit sufficiently that is actually Skyloft. And I'm just going to refer to it as that from now on. This makes even more sense, though, after Twilight Princess, where, ever since they discovered those flying ruins up there, which, remember, had people on them, the little man-chicken things. God, Twilight Princess just had some weird design choices. But it had people up there, and there's the possibility of some kind of trade or coordination with them, which makes sense that they would then, on the ground here in Hyrule, create the Tower of Winds to be able to go up and regularly coordinate with them. And maybe they migrated away, or maybe they were all killed off by Ganon or Vadi. I mean, who knows, right? But then, we have to go and actually take it down and end up causing the destruction of Skyloft, finally, in Four Swords, which I really like that idea. All of this is just speculation, of course, but it's just speculation I like. Let me check my notes. My notes are all over the place, because I was really having trouble fitting it all in this one page. You're probably like, why did I have to fit it all on one page? It was my last page of this booklet, and I talked about the darkness. I talked about that, the darkness. So the second Ganon thing, and the trident. This is a weird one, okay? Given what we know, it's still unclear as if this is the same Ganon or not. The phrasing is a little unclear in the Hyrule Historia, and given the original intent, which I do think matters, it still could swing either way. This is either our Ganon, basically born back, just like he is in Zelda 1, just like he is, like they were trying to do in Zelda 2, or this is a completely new individual who has inherited his power. We're not sure which is true. But again, like I said, with the original intent, I think it's more likely this is him born back. This is him coming back from the dead and taking the trident and becoming even more powerful than he had been before. But of course, that's the original timeline, which doesn't exist. The original, intent of the game. In the new thing, I still think that's true. I still think that this is our Ganon, for two reasons. Number one, the pieces fit very seamlessly for this to basically be Ganon 2. There's like no real variance other than a lack of personality because he doesn't get that much screen time between this Ganondorf and the Ganondorf we know. It's still a Ganondorf, he's still a Gerudo, he still goes, he gets this power, he becomes Ganon, blah, blah, blah. The only significant difference is that this Ganon specifically becomes empowered by the Trident, which I'll talk about in a moment. And that's it, really. That's the full extent of that. But again, the phrasing is still vague enough in the Historia and in the way that the people have talked about this in interviews that we don't actually know if this is our Ganon or not. So it's up to you. Decide whatever you feel is best. Feel free to say in the comments what you prefer and why, if you prefer. The Trident, though, I find fascinating. There's a very strong theory that I adhere to as canon that the Trident was created by the Twilight. The way it's talked about, it is exactly the kind of thing they would make. It is a weapon that contains a tremendous amount of power of darkness and is basically an opposite to the Master Sword. Now, here's the interesting thing. I mentioned this on my stream, the idea of the Trident, and the idea that it's the thing that can empower you. It's worth noting that in the original concept, this would have been the first time Ganon gains the Trident, and he would use it basically henceforth. And that would also explain, empowering him further, blah, blah, blah. But the idea of this being this opposite to the Four Sword or the Master Sword is very, very clear and very blatant. It is a weapon of evil, a weapon that personifies darkness. This trident is actually what is causing the darkness to spread across the land, not Ganon himself, and not Vadi. Vadi is just causing magic to spread across the land, right? So it's obviously very powerful. It also fits with what the Twilight do so perfectly. Everything about it just screams them. These are the people who created the fused shadow, remember? These are the interlopers is what the Twilight are also sometimes referred to as. These are the people who created the fused shadow. And the idea that this thing has been here for forever and untouched kind of fits in with that. It also would actually have a weird way of tying this into Twilight Princess, because just after we have discovered the Twilight's existence and finally cut them off from our realm by taking out the mirror, we found one of their relics, which was left here, and it empowers this new Ganon, whether he is an actually new being or just the brought back from the dead Ganon. And again, it causes all the problems that it does from this point on, or at least it would have. But anyways, one of my viewers mentioned something about the Trident. The idea that, the Trident in my mind works really well as an anti-Master Sword. Something created by the interlopers, the Twilight. Something very, very powerful. All this stuff I mentioned, right? It just fits in my brain. But he was asking, well, do you not like Girahim being the anti-Master Sword? Because Girahim was clearly the anti-Master Sword. He was designed to be that way. It's just, in many ways, that never really worked for me. It never had the oomph behind it. He was just some guy who was a sword, and we knew nothing about him other than that. The idea he postulated, this viewer, when he was watching, was, what if it's both? What if Girahim is the Trident? What if Girahim was made... what if Girahim was, found and then reforged into this trident by the Twilight, given all the shadow power, given all the powers of darkness of it, and the Twilight then sealed it away, realizing that it might be too much, or maybe because someone got a hold of it or they were afraid of it. There's plenty of reasons for that, leading it to being sealed for however many centuries until Ganondorf comes by and gets it. And I really like that idea. That fits all the pieces very, very well, and also keeps Girahim relevant in a weird kind of a way, in the same way it keeps Fi relevant. So I talked about that. One interesting thing is there is a dark world in this game, but it is clearly not the Golden Realm, and it's clearly not the Dark World, which is the Golden Realm. It's also clearly not the Twilight Realm. So what the hell is it? Now, I don't have any really good answers for this. They actually call it the Dark World in this game. They call it a couple of things in this game. The Shadow Realm is another thing they call it. I personally like to think of it as an in-between realm. It might I haven't played Link Between Worlds yet, but it may actually be the equivalent of whatever that world is in the other world there. The idea that you've got, here's Hyrule, and here's the Golden Realm, and there's a realm in between the two that actually helps keep them connected and is mostly connected to the physical realm. Remember, objects can interact with each other across the physical realm and the shadow realm. Like I mentioned earlier, the shadow link literally picking up the corporeal link and carrying him to his destination. So I like that idea, and it also explains why there's only certain parts of it you can reach. There's only certain areas that are connected to it because it's not a complete realm. It's not a whole world. It's just a way of basically having a literal shadow of the actual physical plane here and there. In other words, I don't think I guess I'm explaining myself wrong because it's not actually a whole realm, in my opinion. It's just certain areas of the world have shadows of themselves, and that is being expressed by this. I would also believe that the only reason that these shadows are expressed here and are never seen again, or otherwise in any other games, is because of the same things I mentioned earlier. Vadi's presence and the presence of the trident spreading both darkness and magic across the realm, literally creating these shadows of certain chunks of the world, which is how I think of that. Now, I think I'm out of things to talk about. Let me go over my notes really quick. You should play this game if you haven't. If you play it multiplayer, tell me how it is. I think this is everything. 4 swords, emerald items. Yeah, that's everything. So it's been a great game. I absolutely love this game. We'll see if Link Between Worlds surpasses it. But from now on, we're going to be going through a lot of 3D games. Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, etc. So I'll see you next time, guys.